Among the shadows of the graves inside Colonial Park Cemetery lurks a monster. He's 7 feet tall and covered in hair. Those who have caught a glimpse are haunted by what they've seen. The bodies of small animals are found in his wake, crushed in his strong hands. People whisper his name in hushed tones, afraid that the mere mention could summon him. Rene Asche Rondolier. One day, the body of a little girl is found inside the walls of the cemetery. Everyone knows Renee killed her. A mob quickly forms and Renee is hung from a tree, his massive body left to swing in the wind for several days. Even now, hundreds of years later, a large shadow figure can be spotted inside Colonial Park Cemetery, shifting from one tombstone to another. If you dare enter, you could be Renee's next victim. Let's talk about the Savannah Giant. Growing up in the Florida Panhandle, there were a lot of wooded and swampy areas in my neighborhood. During the day, they were fun to explore, but at night, those areas that felt so safe during the day took on a sinister air. My cousins and I would make up stories about the monsters that lurked in the swamps at night. Why? Because we were scared, and there's a measure of comfort in naming something that you're afraid of. Legends and folklore are designed to keep us safe, pass along warnings to others, and document what we are truly afraid of. Whether or not those stories are true is inconsequential. These stories are more often told as campfire stories now, but I think it's important to keep them alive.
Rene Ash was a celebrated ghost of Savannah, Georgia.
My friend Chris Soucy knows a lot about Savannah's folklore and ghost stories. Over the years, he has collected stories from just about every haunted location in the hostess city. One story that's slowly fallen out of favor with ghost tours here is the story of Rene Asche Rondolier, known to some as the Savannah Giant.
The interesting thing is the difference between when I first took a ghost tour in Savannah, which was in the 90s, and to today. In the 90s, there was not a ghost tour. Well, there weren't that many ghost tours, but you couldn't go on a ghost tour without hearing the story of Rene Ash. People took it because it was an old and established story, told over and over again. But we became really obsessed in the 90s and then certainly in the aughts with the burden of proof and the burden of history and this need to verify all these ghost stories. Rene Ash marauded in Savannah in the late 1700s, according to legend. Not a whole lot of records going on.
While Savannah was established in 1733, many early records have been destroyed due to fires that consumed large portions of the city.
If the story's true, it must be represented somewhere, some newspaper article, something. And there's so many variations on the Rene Ash story. He went from being a giant to being a man with hypertrichosis covered in fur, from killing dogs to killing children. There's so many variants on the story.
Ghost stories are sort of a creepy game of telephone. One person tells someone they saw something strange in the night. That person says they saw something strange with glowing eyes. The next person says they saw something with glowing eyes that cackled like a witch. And it just goes on until the final story hardly resembles the first version at all.
But what I find most interesting is that it made its way into Savannah Spectres, which is Margaret Bolt's great book on Savannah ghosts. It made it into countless ghost tours because people told the story.
If you watched my earlier video about why Savannah is so haunted, you'll remember that this city's existence hasn't been the easiest. Whether it was a war, a natural disaster, or a disease, there have been plenty of threats far out of people's control.
And it is inherent to our peoples to keep it going, to keep telling these stories because they encapsulate what we were afraid of and how we dealt with our fears and how we dealt with these things.
The reason many have stopped telling the story of the Savannah Giant is because there's very little to back up the tales that are told.
The story got so very tightened, right to the point of they hanged him from the tree on the river right where the Marriott stands now, and that his body swung there for 3 days, and someone in the middle of the night cut it down, and they don't know where the body is, and countless stories where people have embellished and they've added and sprinkled in all these little pieces to make it more close to home. But to me, a lot of times ghost stories are to test our fear, to test our mettle. And Renee Ash was a great one for kids, because you tell kids, if you play out too late, Renee Ash is going to get you. If you don't eat your vegetables, Renee Ash is going to get you. Don't do your homework, Renee Ash is going to get you. And I love that there is such a thing as a boogeyman. This combined mythology that a culture can come up with.
It's possible that the story of Renee began to keep children inside at dusk and early evening when mosquitoes were most active. While science didn't know what caused the spread of yellow fever until 1900, people may have noticed a correlation between people who were outside at dusk and people who caught yellow fever.
I don't think ghost stories need facts, because they do detract from the purpose of a ghost story.
Stories that began as a warning quickly evolve into entertainment.
And while I love uncovering the facts behind a ghost story, and I love knowing the tidbits and the pieces, I also respect that this is a tradition.
For years, it was tradition for families to gather around the fireplace in the dark of night and share ghost stories with no other purpose than to frighten and delight those listening.
The endurance of a story is basically, what chord did it strike and how soundly did it strike it? Because we spend our time looking for stories that affirm our feelings and affirm our fear.
In this case, it may have been the loss of a child. If you visit any of the historic cemeteries in Savannah, you'll see countless children's graves. Laurel Grove has several sections called Babyland, specifically for children who died unexpectedly and their parents couldn't afford a grave.
And there's something about the idea of something giant that you can't fight. You wonder if the monster wasn't just a representation of that, because Savannah has always been the blockaded city.
Savannah was also held by the British during the Revolutionary War and overtaken by General Sherman's Union forces during the Civil War.
We were always occupied. And to have some big, gigantic force that we couldn't repel, that could take our children, these are the things that you kind of say, I see it's almost a defeated nation syndrome monster.
You could make the argument that the yellow fever epidemics and wars are a thing of the past and that the story of Renee no longer holds a place in Savannah's folklore. But doesn't it?
I have always been a proponent for holding on to folklore and holding on to the spoken word and the storytelling elements of those things. Not because I think we need to know the truth as much as we need to know the people who told these stories. It's worth always mentioning that this is folklore, that this is, a traditional ghost story.
Sometimes, just like my cousins and I needed to put a name to the scariness in the swamps, people need a name for what goes bump in the night, even today.
But I have, in my life, met several people who've had encounters that they decidedly said was Rene Ash. Most interestingly was a tale from Warren Square, where a person literally felt like he was being chased by a giant man. Caught sight of this thing, and it was charging at him. So he was running, and he ran across State Street there. And when he looked behind him, even though he was sure the thing was right behind him, there was nothing behind him. And it was one of those, like, that's weird, because that's very typical of a Renee Ash story, but it's the wrong location. We were kind of conditioned to believe that he only haunts this area, the Colonial Park Cemetery area. But sometimes you just need a name for what's chasing you.
While there's no definitive proof that Renee or anyone like him existed, I've heard stories from enough people about strange shadow figures that they've seen lurking in and around Colonial Park Cemetery. So the next time you're over there at night, keep an eye out. Or you could be Renee's next victim.